"What the hell do you think you're doing, Frank?" Jake's voice, usually a low, steady rumble, was sharp, like a rock cracking under pressure. It cut through the quiet hum of the workshop, a space that had always been their sanctuary. Frank Callahan didn't look up, not right away. His 74-year-old knees protested. He knelt on the cold concrete, his gnarled fingers tracing the edge of a jagged crack in the floor. A fissure that hadn't been there last week. "Felt a tremor the other night," Frank said, his own voice gravelly with age and disuse. "Shook the whole house. Just notice this." From the corner of his eye, he saw Jake's dusty combat boots step closer, too close, crowding him. "It's an old garage, Frank. Concrete cracks. Let me get some filler next time I'm at the hardware store." There was an urgency in Jake's tone, a command disguised as a suggestion. Frank had spent 30 years in the Navy, 20 of them as a SEAL Master Chief. He knew the sound of a man trying to control a situation. He finally looked up, squinting into the silhouette of the man who had been his rock for the last 10 years, Jake Riley. 48 years old, still built like a goddamn oak tree, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. Ryan's best friend, his swim buddy. The only other man who truly understood the gaping hole Ryan's death had left in the world. "Just seems deep," Frank mumbled, pushing a small pebble into the crack. It disappeared without a sound. Jake let out a short, forced laugh. "Deep? Frank, we're not gonna fall through to China. Come on, get up. Your knees can't be happy about that." He reached down, his hand strong on Frank's arm, pulling him to his feet. It wasn't a helpful gesture, it was an extraction. Frank felt himself being maneuvered away from the spot, guided toward the workbench littered with tools and memories. "I brought those new spark plugs for the boat," Jake said, his voice returning to its normal, friendly cadence. But the mask had slipped. For just a second, Frank had seen something else in his eyes. Not concern, not friendship, fear. And in that moment, standing in the dusty San Diego workshop that smelled of oil and salt and grief, Frank Callahan felt a cold dread settle in his gut. A dread he hadn't felt since the day two officers in dress whites had appeared on his doorstep a decade ago. He knew with the certainty of a man who had survived ambushes and firefights that the crack in the concrete was more than just a crack. It was a beginning or an end. Coronado, California, a spit of land where the Navy's elite are forged. For Frank Callahan, it was just home. A small bungalow a few blocks from the naval base, where the sound of helicopters was as common as the cry of seagulls. It was the house he'd bought with his wife, Sarah, the house where they'd raised their son, Ryan. Sarah was gone now, taken by cancer 5 years after they'd lost Ryan, and Ryan was a hero. That's what they told him. That's what the plaque on the wall said. Lieutenant Ryan Callahan, United States Navy SEAL, killed in a tragic training accident off the coast of Virginia. A fast rope insertion exercise gone wrong. A freak equipment malfunction. That was the official story. Jake Riley was the one who delivered the unofficial story. He was the one who sat with Frank on the back porch for hours, a bottle of whiskey between them, and described Ryan's last moments. He'd been right there. He'd seen it all. He spoke of Ryan's courage, his calmness even as things went sideways. He made the pointless, messy reality of an accident sound like a warrior's final, noble act. In the years that followed, Jake became the glue that held Frank's shattered life together. He was there when Sarah's illness got bad, running errands, sitting with her so Frank could get a few hours of sleep. After she passed, he made it his mission to keep Frank from fading away. Every Saturday, without fail, Jake would show up at the bungalow. "Time to work on the Trident," he'd say, and they'd spend the day in the workshop, tinkering with the 24-foot fishing boat Ryan had loved more than anything. They'd replace a hose, polish the chrome, check the engine. They rarely took it out on the water. The work itself was the point. It was a ritual. A way of keeping Ryan alive between them. Jake would talk about the teams, about the new guys, the new gear. He'd tell stories about their deployments together, carefully edited stories that were full of humor and brotherhood, with all the real darkness sanded off the edges. For Frank, it was a lifeline. Jake was a surrogate son, a living connection to the world that had both made and broken his boy. He'd come to love Jake, not like he loved Ryan, but in a different, profound way. He was family, the only family he had left. He trusted him, implicitly, completely. Until today. Now, As Frank stood at the workbench, pretending to examine a new spark plug, he couldn't shake the image of Jake's face, that fleeting, naked panic. "You look tired, Frank," Jake said, already busy organizing a set of wrenches on the pegboard. "You sleeping okay?" "Same as always," Frank grunted. "Maybe you should see the doc, get a checkup. We're not getting any younger, you know." The words were kind. The intention felt different. Was he worried about Frank's health? Or was he testing him, probing for weakness? Looking for signs of senility, of a mind that could be easily dismissed? The old Master Chief in him stirred, the part of him that was trained to assess threats, to read people, to see the tells they didn't even know they were giving. He looked around the workshop, their sanctuary. For 10 years, this space had been a comfort. Now, it felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to hide something. And the floor, the solid, dependable concrete floor he'd poured with Ryan 20 years ago, felt like thin ice. "Yeah," Frank said, turning the small, cold piece of metal over in his hand. "Maybe I will." He watched Jake work, his movements efficient and precise, the way a SEAL does everything. But his shoulders were tight, his jaw was clenched. He was putting on a performance. And Frank, for the first time in 10 years, was seeing right through it. The conversation that afternoon was strained. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, fragile silence punctuated by meaningless small talk. Jake left earlier than usual, claiming he had to prepare for a consulting trip up to LA for a few days. "Take it easy, Frank," he said at the door, clapping a hand on Frank's shoulder. The touch felt heavy, proprietary, and "Stay away from that crack. I'll patch it up when I get back on Friday. Promise." Frank just nodded, watching Jake's truck pull away from the curb until it was just a red speck in the distance. He closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the empty house. He walked back to the workshop, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows. He stood over the crack in the floor. It was a jagged line, like a lightning bolt frozen in stone. A promise. It sounded more like a threat. Doubt is a poison. It starts as a drop and seeps into everything. For the next 2 days, Frank lived with it, tasted it in his coffee, felt it in the empty spaces of his house. He replayed the scene in the workshop over and over. Jake's eyes, the frantic edge to his voice. The way he'd physically moved Frank away from the crack. It wasn't right. His mind, trained for decades to recognize patterns, to find the anomaly in a sea of normalcy, began to churn. He started pulling at threads from the past, things that hadn't made sense at the time, but that he'd dismissed, filed away under the fog of grief. He remembered a conversation a few months after Ryan's funeral. One of Ryan's other teammates, a young buck named Miller, had stopped by with a casserole. They'd been talking, and Miller had mentioned the training accident. "Worst part is," he'd said, shaking his head, "is that if Ree had just been wearing his own rig, it never would have happened." "His own rig?" Frank had asked. "Yeah," Miller said, then he seemed to catch himself. "I mean, it was all regulation gear, of course. Just you know how Ryan was, superstitious, he never used loaner equipment if he could help it. Weird that he did that day. At the time, Frank had thought nothing of it. In the chaos of an exercise, things get swapped, but now. And there was something else. A year or so after the accident, Frank had been cleaning out Ryan's old laptop. He'd found a draft of an email, unsent, addressed to the squadron's commanding officer. The subject line was just one word, concern. The body of the email was blank. Frank had assumed it was about some minor command issue, a butt dial of an email, and deleted it. But what if it wasn't? He sat in his worn leather armchair, the house dark around him, and pieced it together. A blank email titled Concern, a comment about Ryan using gear that wasn't his own. And Jake, always Jake, the sole narrator of Ryan's final moments. The one who had controlled the entire story. He felt a profound sense of shame. He was Master Chief Frank Callahan. He'd taught young SEALs how to survive by trusting their gut, by seeing what others missed, and for 10 years, he'd been blind. Grief was a powerful anesthetic. It had numbed his instincts, made him accept the story he so desperately needed to be true, the story of a hero's death. But what if it wasn't a hero's death? What if it was something else entirely? The poison of doubt was now a raging infection. He knew he couldn't let it go. He couldn't call the Navy. What would he say? My son's best friend acted weird about a crack in my garage floor. They'd think he was a crazy old man, drowning in grief. They'd pat him on the head and send a chaplain to talk to him. No, this was he had to know, for Ryan. On Thursday night, a day before Jake was due back, Frank made his decision. The tremor that had cracked the floor felt like an act of God, a sign from Ryan, from beyond the grave, telling him to look. He waited until well after midnight, when the neighborhood was asleep and the only sound was the distant foghorn from the bay. He went to the workshop. He flicked on the single, bare light bulb overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. He found the heavy 10-pound sledgehammer in the corner. His hands, spotted with age, felt clumsy as he gripped the wooden handle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He stood over the crack. This felt like a desecration. A violation of the sanctuary he had shared with Jake, of the memory of his son. He took a deep breath. "For you, Ryan," he whispered into the silence. He lifted the sledgehammer. It felt impossibly heavy. His back screamed in protest. He swung. The first blow was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. A spiderweb of new fractures appeared on the concrete surface. He swung again, and again. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wasn't just breaking concrete, he was breaking the last 10 years of his life. He was shattering the comfortable lie he had lived in. With every swing, a memory of him and Jake laughing, working, grieving together, flashed in his mind, and he brought the hammer down harder, trying to smash it all to pieces. After 20 minutes of brutal, exhausting work, a section of the concrete gave way, crumbling into rubble. He dropped the sledgehammer, its clang deafening in the sudden quiet. He knelt down, his body trembling with exertion and adrenaline. He reached into the hole he'd made, pushing aside chunks of broken concrete and dirt. His fingers brushed against something hard, rectangular, and plastic. It wasn't a bone. It was a box. His hand shook as he worked to free it from its tomb of earth and stone. It was a pelican case, military grade, designed to be waterproof and indestructible. The kind of case seals use to protect sensitive equipment. He finally pulled it free. It was heavy. He set it on the unbroken part of the floor, dust motes dancing in the beam of the overhead light. His breath hitched. He stared at the two latches on the front, knowing that once he opened them, nothing would ever be the same. He took a moment. He thought of Ryan's smile, the way he looked in his dress whites, the quiet confidence he carried. He thought of Jake, the steady presence, the shared grief, the brother his son had chosen, two images at war in his mind. He popped the first latch. The sound was a sharp, definitive click. He popped the second. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a simple, tarnished chain. Lying on top of a folded piece of fabric was a set of dog tags, Ryan's dog tags. The ones the Navy had told him were lost at sea, unrecoverable. Frank felt the air leave his lungs in a rush, as if he'd been punched. He reached in with a trembling hand and picked them up. They were cool against his skin. Callahan, Ryan M. The letters were stamped into the metal, a permanent record of his boy's existence. Beneath the tags was a folded shemagh, a desert scarf Ryan had favored, and beneath that, Frank's blood ran cold. It was a knife, a kabar, but not a standard issue one. This one had a custom handle, carved from dark, polished wood. Frank had seen it 100 times, not in Ryan's possession. It was Jake's, a gift from his own father, he'd once said. Jake was never without it. Lying next to the knife was a small, waterproof baggie. Inside was a single, spent shell casing, and a small, black USB drive. Frank sat back on his heels, the concrete cold against his old bones. The workshop, once a place of healing, now felt like a crypt. This wasn't a memorial. It wasn't a collection of keepsakes hidden away. This was an evidence locker. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to the local police. This was a military matter. This was out of their league. He went back into the house, leaving the open case on the workshop floor like a gaping wound. He found his phone. His hands were steady now, the adrenaline replaced by an icy resolve. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Special Agent Peterson, NCIS. A man he'd met once at a retirement ceremony, who had given Frank his card and said, "If you ever need anything, Master Chief, anything at all." Frank never thought he'd make that call. He dialed the number. Peterson. The voice on the other end was awake, alert. "Agent Peterson," Frank said, his own voice sounding distant, foreign. "This is Frank Callahan, Ryan Callahan's father." There was a pause. "Master Chief, it's late." "Is everything all right?" "No," Frank said, his eyes fixed on the open door to the workshop. "Nothing is all right. I need you to come to my house. And I need you to be quiet about it." "What's going on, Frank?" Frank took a ragged breath. I think I just found my son's murderer." 2 hours later, Frank's quiet street was subtly invaded. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just 2 dark sedans that parked a block away, and for figures in civilian clothes who approached his house on foot. Agent Peterson was a tall, lean man in his late 40s with tired eyes that had seen too much. He introduced his younger partner, a sharp-looking woman named Agent Ross. They listened patiently as Frank, sitting at his kitchen table, recounted the story. The crack, Jake's reaction, his own growing suspicions. The sledgehammer, the Pelican case. He spoke in a low, flat monotone, the words coming out as if they belonged to someone else. When he was done, a heavy silence filled the room. Peterson looked at Ross, a silent communication passing between them, then he turned back to Frank. "Master Chief," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "You understand what you're alleging here. Jake Riley is one of the most decorated operators of his generation, a legend. You're saying he murdered his teammate, your son, and has been deceiving you for a decade." "I'm not alleging anything," Frank said, his voice hard as iron. "I'm telling you what I found. The box is in the workshop. See for yourself." Peterson nodded slowly. "Okay, Frank, let's see it." As they stood to go to the workshop, the headlights of a truck swept across the front window. The sound of a diesel engine rumbled, then died. Frank's heart seized. "He's back," he whispered. "He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow." Agent Ross moved to the window, peering through the blinds. "Ford F-50, it's him." A key slid into the front door lock. The NCIS agents exchanged another look. Peterson put a finger to his lips, then gestured for Frank to stay put. He and Ross moved silently into the shadows of the living room, their hands resting near the firearms concealed beneath their jackets. The front door opened. Jake stepped inside, dropping a duffel bag on the floor. "Frank," he called out, "you still up?" He walked into the kitchen, stopping dead when he saw Frank sitting at the table, his face a pale, grim mask in the dim light. "Frank, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He took a step forward, a look of concern on his face. It was a perfect performance. "Hello, Jake," Agent Peterson said, stepping out of the shadows. Agent Ross emerged on his other side, her stance solid, professional. Jake froze, his eyes darted from Peterson to Ross, then back to Frank. The friendly mask evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard watchfulness. The operator inside him took over. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Special Agent Peterson, NCIS, Peterson said calmly, holding up his badge. "This is Agent Ross. We need to ask you a few questions." Jake's eyes narrowed, fixing on Frank. The look he gave him was terrifying. It was pure, undiluted hatred, the love and friendship of a decade burned away in a single, silent moment. "Frank, what did you do?" "Your workshop, Mr. Riley," Peterson said, cutting him off. "We'd like to take a look at it." "You don't have a warrant," Jake snarled. "You can't just." "I live here," Frank said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and grief. "It's my workshop, and I'm giving them permission." Jake's composure finally cracked. A muscle in his jaw twitched violently. "Frank, don't be a fool. You're not thinking straight. These people, they don't understand. You and me, we." "Show them the workshop, Jake," Frank said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. The walk across the yard was the longest of Frank's life. The 4 of them, a grim procession under the cold California moon. Peterson led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When they entered the workshop, the scene was exactly as Frank had left it. The discarded sledgehammer, the crater in the floor, and the open Pelican case, its contents exposed under the harsh glare of the single light bulb. Agent Ross knelt by the case, her expression unreadable. Jake stared at it, his face ashen. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a hollow, chilling stillness. Frank whispered, the name a question, an accusation, a plea. Jake slowly turned his head to look at Frank. There were no more lies in his eyes, only a vast, empty darkness. He was going to ruin everything, Frank, he said, his voice barely audible. Everything we built, he was going to throw it all away. Peterson stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Jake Riley, you're under arrest for the murder of Lieutenant Ryan Callahan. As the cold steel clicked around his wrists, Jake didn't resist. He just kept his eyes locked on Frank, a final, terrible connection between the man who had lost a son and the man who had taken him. I loved him, Frank, Jake whispered as they led him away. You have to believe that. I loved him like a brother. Frank stood alone in the doorway of the workshop, the place of his son's tomb, and watched them put the murderer of his child into the back of an unmarked car. The word brother hung in the air, a final, obscene betrayal. The interrogation room at the NCIS field office was sterile and cold. Jake Riley sat at the metal table, no longer the confident SEAL operator, but a man hollowed out from the inside. The confession didn't come in a flood, but in a slow, agonizing trickle, as if he were pulling pieces of his own soul out for inspection. The story he told wasn't one of a simple training accident. It was a story of a covert operation gone terribly wrong. It happened 9 months before Ryan's death, a deniable op in the Horn of Africa. A high-value target, the intelligence was bad. They walked into a trap. In the chaos of the firefight, pinned down and taking heavy fire, Jake made a call. He called in an airstrike on a building they believed was full of enemy fighters. He was wrong. The building contained civilians, women, children. They didn't know until after the smoke cleared. It was a massacre, a war crime. In the frantic aftermath, a decision was made. They would bury it. The official report listed the casualties as enemy combatants. The story was sealed, the mission deemed a success. Everyone on the team went along with it. The brotherhood, the code of silence, was absolute. Everyone except Ryan. He couldn't let it go, Jake said, his voice raspy, staring at his cuffed hands on the table. For months, he was a ghost. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He kept talking about it, about the faces, the kids. Ryan, Frank's son, had been raised with a moral compass as true as the North Star. The lie was eating him alive. He told Jake he was going to confess, to report the truth to the command, regardless of the consequences. It would have meant the end of their careers, prison time, disgrace for the entire SEAL community. He was going to burn it all down. Frank, Jake said, looking up at the one-way mirror, as if he knew Frank was watching from the other side. For what? For a truth that wouldn't bring anyone back? We did what we had to do to survive. That's the job. He forgot that. The final confrontation happened on a remote training range in Virginia. It was just the two of them, prepping for a night exercise. Ryan told Jake he drafted the email to their CO. He was sending it that night. They argued. It got heated. I just wanted to make him see sense, Jake whispered. He was being selfish. He wasn't thinking about the team, about the other guys, and their families. Ryan wouldn't back down. He called Jake a coward, a murderer hiding behind a uniform. Something inside Jake snapped. The years of pressure, of violence, of burying his own humanity to do the job. It all came to a head. He pushed Ryan hard. Ryan stumbled backward, his head striking the steel frame of a transport vehicle. The same way a man might fall in a bar fight. A stupid, clumsy accident born of rage. But Ryan didn't get up. Jake checked his pulse. Nothing. In a single, senseless moment, his brother in arms, his best friend, was dead. Panic set in. He could tell the truth. It was manslaughter, at worst. But the truth would lead to questions. It would unravel the bigger lie, the one about the botched airstrike. His life, his career, his legacy would all be over. So he chose another lie, a bigger one. He spent the next hour staging the scene. He swapped out Ryan's gear with a faulty set from the training locker. He carried Ryan's body to the Fastrope Tower. And the Pelican case? He buried that under the workshop floor a week later. When he was in San Diego, helping Frank with the funeral arrangements, he couldn't bring himself to destroy Ryan's dog tags. The knife was his own, dropped in the struggle. The USB drive contained Ryan's unsent email and his own damning after-action report from the Africa mission. He'd hidden it all, A dark secret buried in the one place no one would ever think to look, a father's shrine to his son. For 10 years, he lived the lie. He soothed Frank's grief with the poison that had killed his son. He became the perfect surrogate son, his penance and his prison all at once. Every Saturday, Jake's voice cracked, the first real emotion showing through. Every damn Saturday, working on that boat, I was just trying to make it right, trying to be the son you lost. On the other side of the glass, Frank Callahan stood up and walked out of the observation room. He couldn't listen anymore. The headlines were brutal. SEAL hero murdered by teammate. Decade of deceit. The Jake Riley story. The media descended on Frank's small street, a flock of vultures drawn to the scent of tragedy. Frank ignored them. He was a ghost in his own home, moving through rooms that felt alien to him. The pictures on the wall of Ryan and Jake, smiling together on a deployment, felt like a cruel joke. The hardest part was the second funeral. There was no honor guard this time, no 21-gun salute. Just a quiet service to move Ryan's remains to the family plot next to his mother. Frank had to bury his son all over again, but this time, he was burying the truth, the real Ryan. Not the sanitized hero from the Navy's press release, but a complicated, honorable man who had died trying to do the right thing, trying to cleanse his conscience. After the service, Frank stood alone in the cemetery. He looked at the new, simple headstone. Ryan M. Callahan. Below it, he'd had a new line etched. The truth will set you free. He didn't know if he was talking to Ryan or to himself. The trial was a formality. With the evidence from the Pelican case and Jake's full confession, the verdict was swift. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. Frank didn't attend. He watched the verdict on the news, feeling nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just a vast, hollow emptiness. He sold the house in Coronado, too many ghosts. He sold the Trident, the boat he and Jake had spent a decade preserving. He kept nothing but a few pictures and Ryan's dog tags, which he now wore around his own neck, beneath his shirt. He moved to a small, quiet town in the mountains, a place with no ocean, no helicopters, no memories. He bought a small cabin with a porch, and he watched the seasons change. He tried to reconcile the two Jakes in his mind, the monster who had murdered his son, and the friend who had held his hand as his wife died. He tried to understand how both could exist in the same man. He never could. Some things, he realized, were not meant to be understood. They were just meant to be survived. A year passed, then another. The world moved on, as it always does. Frank Callahan found a quiet rhythm in his new life. He was old, and he was alone, but he was no longer adrift. One cool autumn morning, he drove the long hours from his mountain home to Arlington National Cemetery. He hadn't been back to DC since Ryan was first interred there, a lifetime ago. He found Ryan's original gravesite, marked by a pristine white headstone. The Navy had never removed it. Here, in the nation's most sacred ground, the lee of the hero's death was still preserved in marble. Frank stood before it, the cool metal of his son's dog tags a comforting weight against his chest. He wasn't angry anymore. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice soft, carried away by the wind. "Sorry it took me so long to get here." He reached out and placed a hand on the cold stone. "You know, for 10 years, I came here, and I was proud. Proud of the hero's story they told me, but I was wrong." He paused, looking out over the endless rows of identical stones, a silent army at rest. "I'm prouder now," he continued, a tear finally tracing a path through the wrinkles on his weathered cheek. "Proud of the man you really were, the one who couldn't live with a lie. The one who chose his conscience over his career, over his brothers, over everything. That's real honor, son, not dying in some made-up accident, but choosing to die for the truth." He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a heavy, painful peace, but peace nonetheless. He had lost his son twice to a lie, and once to the truth. And in the end, it was the truth that had, finally, set them both free. He took one last look at the headstone, gave it a final, gentle pat, and turned to walk away, his back straight, his steps steady, a father who had finally found his way home. The story of Frank and Ryan Callahan is a difficult one. It's a reminder that the deepest wounds are often inflicted by those we trust the most, and that the line between a hero and a monster can sometimes be terrifyingly thin. But it's also a story about the enduring power of a father's love and the relentless pursuit of truth. Frank's journey shows us that true honor isn't found in the stories we are told, but in the difficult, often painful, truths we choose to live by. What are your thoughts on Frank's incredible and heartbreaking story? What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and stories like these are meant to be shared and discussed. If this story moved you, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more tales that explore the deepest corners of the human heart. Thank you for listening, and take care of one another.